Raising a Socially Successful Child by Dr. Stephen Nowicki, Chapter 2, The 6 Types of Nonverbal Communication, a primer. Although everyone uses nonverbal language in day-to-day life, not many of us spend much time thinking about how and why we use it. As with any language, fluency requires the ability to express yourself clearly, understand what others are saying, and determine the most appropriate way to express something in any given situation or setting. The difference is that unlike verbal language, much of this kind of communication happens unconsciously, and as a result, we tend to ignore it or take it for granted. In fact, nonverbal communication falls into 6 main categories that I will delve into in much greater detail in chapters to come. For now, a primer. Rhythm. The pace at which we respond to others, both with our physical gestures and within the interplay of conversation. Rhythm underpins all of our interactions with others. When you wait for someone else to speak, rather than cutting in, or when you extend a hand to shake, almost at the same moment another person extends a hand, you are instinctively using rhythm to convey respect and make others feel comfortable around you. We've all had the experience of having a conversation with someone and the interaction just flows. This means you and the other person share a compatible rhythm. On the other hand, when someone doesn't wait for his turn to speak and talks over you, it can come across as rude or awkward. Or if you begin a conversation with someone and she pauses for a few too many beats before replying to your questions, speaks too quickly, or answers with only a few words, it can throw your own rhythm off kilter. In other words, when rhythm is incompatible, it can lead to extremely awkward social interactions. Facial expressions. The way we use our eyes, mouth, eyebrows, and forehead to communicate emotion. Your facial expressions allow you to reveal what you are thinking or feeling without saying a word. When you look enthusiastic, others respond with their own enthusiasm. When you look unhappy, others will check to make sure that you're okay. During the pandemic, we all learned how difficult it was to communicate while wearing masks that obscured much of our faces. Conversations became drained of life, and it took a much greater effort to get our message across using our words and eyes alone. Personal space. The area surrounding us that we don't wish others to broach unless we invite them. Imagine someone you don't know standing too close to you at a party. You feel that a physical boundary has been violated and may step away. Most of us are instinctively aware of others' personal space and become uncomfortable when strangers move into what we consider our personal zone. In the throes of the pandemic, we all became much more aware of personal space and became accustomed to putting an even greater distance between ourselves and others, a habit that still lingers. When we give someone else the correct amount of personal space, we're being responsive to their needs without saying a word, making others automatically feel more at ease around us. Physical touch. When we come so close to others that physical contact takes place, either intentionally or unintentionally. When it is appropriate, physical touch can be one of the most effective ways to communicate the warmth you feel toward another person. As a parent, you will often use touch to soothe your child and to allay her fears with an affectionate hug or squeeze of a hand. But touch can also be problematic. Until you have reached a point of familiarity and intimacy with someone in which touch becomes consensual and appropriate, physical contact can be seen as an invasion of the other person's bodily autonomy. This is true even when the touching is accidental, because the person being touched may not know the intent of the toucher. When someone touches you, whether it's a pat on the back, an arm around your shoulders, or a hug, before that point of intimacy has been reached, it can be extremely disconcerting, even when touching is accidental. Even shaking hands, a formalized way of touching others, and hugging can often go wrong. Most of us has probably experienced the classic gaffe of misreading the degree of friendship and going in for a hug while the other person may be initiating a handshake. Vocalics. All the vocal communications we use that don't include words, including the pitch, volume, and speed of our speech, our hesitations, and sounds such as ums and ahs. We all know what it's like to converse with someone who talks too fast or too slowly, and at too low or high a volume. Trying to keep up a conversation with someone who mumbles or speaks so softly that we have to strain our ears to understand them, or who peppers her sentences with too many ums and ahs, can be exhausting. And when someone talks a mile a minute, or at the top of their lungs, it can quickly make us feel as if we need a break from listening to the person. On the other hand, when someone speaks to us at a comfortable volume and pitch, when making out their words doesn't demand all our mental energy, we can pay more attention to the meaning behind what they're saying, and we tend to respond more positively to them as a result. Body language. The movements we make with parts of our bodies, especially our hands, to communicate or emphasize something. Body language also includes our posture, as well as the things we put on our bodies to convey emotion or status, including clothes, jewelry, scents, makeup, and tattoos. People who use their hands to express how they're feeling or to drive home a point generally tend to be more engaging conversationalists and speakers. To some degree, this is true because gestures help emphasize what's being said and drive the interaction along, making the speaker come across as open, friendly, and engaged. Conversely, when someone stands with their arms stiff at their sides or folded tightly across their chest and never uses their hands to gesticulate while speaking, it can give the impression that the person is ill at ease and can even feel slightly off-putting and cold emotionally. Posture is another important aspect of body language and is the only nonverbal signal we can pick up from a distance. People who stand up straight with their arms loosely at their sides, rather than clasped in front of their body, will instantly seem more confident and relaxed, even from many yards away. And instinctively, we are more likely to respond positively to that person. On the other hand, think of a classroom of teenagers slumped in their chairs. They might not all be feeling disinterested, but their body language is sending a powerful message that they're bored and eager to leave. Objectics are the items we wear on our bodies, and they can convey strong messages to others about who we are, our tastes and preferences, our moods, and even the groups or subcultures with whom we identify. Showing up for a job interview in business-appropriate attire, for example, can send a very different message than going to a rock concert in a leather jacket and a lot of metal jewelry. But in both cases, we're signaling something about how we wish to be perceived. For children, too, objectics are a way to identify peers who may share their interests or a group they think may fit in with. But they can also make a child feel excluded or have a distancing effect. A tale of two languages, similarities and differences. Now that we've looked at the different types of nonverbal language, it's important to understand the ways that verbal and nonverbal languages, our two major modes of communication, are alike and, most importantly, how they differ. Verbal and nonverbal language share at least 4 major characteristics. They are both learned. As with verbal language, nonverbal language is something that babies begin to acquire from the moment they open their eyes, and they continue to acquire it with each year that goes by. For both languages, the process of learning follows a typical sequence, and both sequences possess their own developmental milestones that reflect a child's progress. Up to about the first year, most of a child's milestones are nonverbal. For example, smiling, pointing, waving bye-bye. Your child learns that nodding means yes, and a shaking head means no. She realizes that someone who is happy may smile at her and use an encouraging tone of voice or give a thumbs up. She comes to understand that when someone is upset with her, that person may frown at her. After the year mark, verbal milestones predominate. The first word, the first sentence, the first time the child asks for something by name. Over time, the child's vocabulary grows, as does her ability to construct more complex sentences and eventually to read. Meanwhile, her nonverbal vocabulary continues to develop as well, even if we don't mark those milestones with the same fanfare as we do verbal ones. It follows that because nonverbal communication is learned, it can also be taught. In the same way that we might correct a child who mispronounces a word, we can also correct a child who's speaking too loudly, who's interrupting a sibling, or who bumps into a playmate. They are both richly complex. The main component of verbal language is, of course, words. And the English language has plenty of them. In fact, it is one of the world's richest languages, with 171,476 entries in the Oxford English Dictionary 2nd edition. But nonverbal language is also rich in complexity. According to one influential theorist of nonverbal communication, Ray Birdwhistell, literally thousands of different cues can be discerned from human movement, or what he calls kinesics. And renowned linguist Mario P. went even further when he estimated that humans can produce an astounding 700,000 or more physical signals that function as nonverbal communicative cues. Sheesh. This makes sense when you think about how many different emotional cues can be sent nonverbally. Happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, surprise, to name just a few. Then think about how those cues can vary in intensity, high versus low, and everywhere in between. Not only that, but these emotional cues can be carried simultaneously on different nonverbal channels, via our faces, voices, gestures, posture. Mastering and making sense of the constantly changing kaleidoscope of nonverbal cues is no small task indeed, and is just as crucial to a child's social and academic success as the mastery of verbal language. They're both composed of abilities to understand and express. Chances are, you've given a lot of thought to your child's competence in reading, writing, spelling, and speaking. Verbal skills can be separated into those we learn to understand, the written and spoken words of others, and those we use to express ourselves in words to others. But like most parents, you've probably spent much less time focusing on how well your child is doing nonverbally. Nonverbal language skills can be classified in the exact same way that verbal ones can, as expressive, the ability to use nonverbal cues to express oneself, or receptive, the ability to read nonverbal cues. As is also the case for verbal language, the ability to read nonverbal cues is separate and independent from the skill in expressing them. So in the same way that a child might struggle with reading comprehension, but have no trouble constructing a complex sentence, for example, a child can be adept at reading others' facial expressions, but still struggle with expressing their own. Another child might be quite skilled at expressing their own emotions nonverbally, but be less advanced when it comes to reading and understanding the emotional information being conveyed by the facial expressions, tones of voice, and gestures of their peers. Both types of skills are important. After all, it doesn't matter if you know how to behave in response to an angry person if you misread his or her angry facial expression as sad. The good news is that just because a child is having trouble interpreting nonverbal cues doesn't necessarily mean she's having any difficulty using them. And most children are perfectly capable of learning both receptive and expressive nonverbal skills, but for a variety of reasons may not have had the opportunities to acquire the appropriate competencies for their age and situation. They are both shaped by culture. Each culture has its own nonverbal language, just as it has its own verbal language. Consider the traditional ways Americans and Japanese people greet one another. In Japan, the custom is to bow, but even if someone uses the Western practice of shaking hands, the grip is light and the eyes are averted. Contrast that with the somewhat aggressive American practice of beginning the greeting with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. I have a colleague, world-famous primatologist Franz de Waal, who is multilingual and one of the few members of our faculty who can present his research in verbal languages other than English. I've had the opportunity to observe Franz when he's speaking to someone in a language other than English. And it has helped to remind me that each verbal language is accompanied by its own nonverbal one. When Franz speaks Dutch or German, for example, I notice his posture is more erect and he uses fewer gestures than when he speaks Italian or French. Unlike Franz, most people who learn a foreign language never learn to use the accompanying nonverbal language. They may be bilingual, but they are unikinesic, meaning they only use their native nonverbal language. Franz, on the other hand, would be described as multilingual and multikinesic. Despite all their similarities, verbal and nonverbal language also differ in multiple ways. And these differences are key to understanding why children who lag behind in these skills find themselves struggling both emotionally and socially. We're less conscious of how we use nonverbal language compared to verbal language. While we're generally very conscious of what we are saying or writing, rarely do we have the same level of awareness about how we are expressing ourselves nonverbally, or how we are interpreting the nonverbal signals we receive from others. This is why some children, like Jack, who we met earlier, are unaware not only of their own nonverbal missteps, but also of how others are reacting to those missteps and why. It's also why problems with nonverbal language seem harder to diagnose than those with verbal language. Complicating matters further, most people aren't always aware of why they react to these missteps the way they do. We might feel frustrated after conversing with someone who peppers their speech with excessively long pauses, but unable to identify the source of the frustration. Even on the rare occasions where we might be aware of and able to articulate the nonverbal missteps of others, our good manners may prevent us from pointing them out. For example, if someone stands too close to us or stares at us for too long, it's likely that we'll simply move away from that person rather than telling them we feel uncomfortable. As a result, when kids make nonverbal mistakes, they rarely get the corrective feedback they need. Rather, they may be able to sense something is off in their attempts to connect, but they don't know what it is or how to make things better. If they continue to pursue a connection while still making mistakes that make other children uncomfortable, they could end up being socially excluded, labeled an oddball, or worse. This lack of awareness about how emotions are transmitted through nonverbal channels may contribute to the development of failed social adjustments and emotional problems, especially during the transition from childhood to adolescence. And in the absence of any intervention, this low emotional awareness may pave the way for more serious difficulties down the line. Nonverbal language is used more continuously and involuntarily than verbal language and is impossible to turn off. Nonverbal behavior is always on. It's on when we speak and when we are quiet. with or without our permission. Think of how, even once you've finished talking, your body remains in constant motion, sending signals with your posture, gestures, and facial expressions. When I give talks, I often mention this characteristic of nonverbal language, saying, I'm the only person talking at the moment, but each and every one of you is communicating with me now by the way you're sitting or stretching or rolling your eyes or yawning or looking around the room. You can't stop it, and I can't help but be affected by it. As soon as I say this, something unique happens to the people in the audience. They freeze. Everyone sits up straight, trying not to move a muscle, which means that any movement they do make is made much louder by the effort. I usually hear squeaking noises coming from desks or chairs as people try their hardest not to communicate in the ways I've just described, but do in spite of themselves. Paul Watzlawick, world-famous psychotherapist, suggested that we cannot not communicate nonverbally. When we consider the involuntary nature of nonverbal communication, coupled with the fact that it often takes place outside our awareness, it is easy to see how children could be continually making nonverbal mistakes without realizing it. Nonverbal language is learned less directly and less systematically compared to verbal language. At school, children are taught to use verbal and written language in formalized, intentional ways. Spelling tests and written homework assignments are corrected, marked, and returned to students, who may then be told to redo the portions of the assignment that they answered incorrectly. And when the children read out loud, teachers will correct students' pronunciation, grammar, and other errors. No one ever questions why things are done this way. We accept that learning to read and write is a critical component of a child's formal education. In contrast, educators rarely dedicate classroom time to teaching nonverbal language. Your child won't be graded on an assignment that asks him to identify the correct facial expression for sadness so he can learn how it differs from anger. There certainly won't be quizzes about how close to stand next to peers, how long to maintain eye contact when answering the teacher's question, or how to use body language to show interest in what a classmate is saying. These skills are just as important as knowing when to use a semicolon in a sentence, yet they are rarely on the curriculum. Nonverbal language has a more visceral impact than verbal language. When someone breaks a rule of verbal language, a spelling error in an email or using a figure of speech incorrectly, for example, we usually shrug it off. That's because we process the mistake intellectually, often correctly attributing it to mere carelessness. But when people fail to follow the rules of nonverbal language, perhaps a stranger sits down next to you in a movie theater despite there being plenty of empty seats with equally good views of the screen. You process it emotionally and are likely to respond intuitively, perhaps by scooting away from the person whom you now view as strange or even threatening. When nonverbal and verbal language convey conflicting emotional messages, we tend to accept the nonverbal one as true. Despite the fact that nonverbal communication flies under the radar, it's actually extremely powerful, often more powerful than verbal communication. When you ask someone if she's having a good day, and she says yes in a sad, shaky voice, you're likely to believe what's being conveyed by her tone rather than her words. Similarly, if the person you're chatting with at a party keeps telling you how much they're enjoying the conversation, but steals glances at his watch or phone every 30 seconds, his nonverbal behavior is sending a clear message that he'd rather be someplace else. Incongruence between the verbal and nonverbal can cause countless problems for a child who's unaware of the overpowering emotional messages he may be sending to others. As we've seen, nonverbal language is every bit as complex and every bit as useful in communicating information and emotion as its verbal partner. In the chapters ahead, you'll learn the rules and dynamics of nonverbal language and how to help your child master them. Next up, the silent orchestra unlocking the power of nonverbal language to play the beautiful music of relationships. Ooh, that sounds good.